Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you about an important topic that I think we all are concerned about. I'm the Regional Science Liaison here for EPA Region 9 out of San Francisco. My job is to connect our regional office and all of our regional partners, including all of you folks, with the Office of Research and Development. And I'm going to speak first, but I want to give a chance for my collaborator here, Suzanne Fluharty, to briefly introduce herself, and then we'll get on with the presentation.
Well, ayakui, everybody. I am Suzanne Fluharty. I'm environmental staff for the Yurok tribe in north of California on the Pacific Ocean. And I'm speaking today mostly from my role as a Region 9 representative on the National Tribal Toxic Council, which is a working group with EPA to try and pull together from all 10 regions tribe concerns and bring them up and track them through EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. And I'll speak after Matt has introduced the big picture and the information. Yay. So I look forward to hearing what he has to present.
Great. Thank you. All right, folks, you can type questions into the chat box as we go along, and then if we have time, we'll address those at the end and take verbal questions as well. So I think most of us are somewhat familiar with PFAS, but I'll give a little bit of background. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and they're a group of man-made chemicals that have been used since the 1940s, used in a wide array of consumer products and applications. I think one of the ones we're most familiar with is non-stick cookware. Certainly food packaging is another common use. You know, those white cardboard packages you may take food home from the restaurant in, and they have a kind of a slick plastic on the inside of the cardboard that has some PFAS in it. Stain and water repellent. How many people have ever bought some of that 3M water repellent spray and sprayed your boots down real well and try and make them waterproof? That's certainly one source that's used in fabrics, carpets, clothing, and probably most famously for a lot of the sources we're finding, it's used in fire retardant foams, firefighting foams. So that's what PFAS is. And some of the known sources that we have, again, are the firefighting foams, industry uses in creating carpets and clothing, incineration and thermal treatment facilities, landfill leachate, and potentially spreading of biosolids from landfills can contain, landfill leachate, wastewater effluent, and potentially land application of biosolids can also contain PFAS. It's a group of over 6,000 chemicals, so there's a lot of different chemicals in this family. Why is it a problem? Well, these chemicals are widespread, they are mobile in the environment, they're bioaccumulative, meaning that they can build up in our body over time. They're toxic at very low levels. We're often talking about part per trillion levels, and they don't break down quickly. So these are all the things that we do not want to have in a compound. Mobile, bioaccumulative, widespread, toxic, and they don't break down quickly. In fact, most people in the US have been exposed to PFAS, and we can even see the Centers for Disease Control in the NHANES data set shows PFAS in the blood of many people around the US. So this compound is out there. It's in our food, it's in our water, it's in our clothing, it's in our bodies. So as a result, EPA has realized that this is a big problem, and we put together an action plan intended to assist states, tribes, and communities in addressing PFAS issues. You can see the link here. I'll have a lot of links throughout this presentation, and the presentation is on the website, and you can download it and get this information for more detail. The EPA Action Plan has a number of things that we're planning to address, and I'll cover some of the progress here. With respect to drinking water, the current EPA drinking water advisory is 70 parts per trillion. 70 parts per trillion, to get an idea, is like a few grains of salt in a swimming pool. It's a very, very small amount. And that's a health advisory. It's not an enforceable level. It's not a regulatory level. I'll talk more about that in a moment. February 20th, 2020, EPA initiated the process for regulating 2 of these PFAS compounds, the PFOS and PFOA, in drinking water. Ultimately, we expect that will result in an MCL, though that will take several years. EPA has approved drinking water analysis methods for 29 PFAS compounds. These are the 2 methods that we've approved, and that's for drinking water only. That's not for water at cleanup sites, not for soil, it's for drinking water only. We've also determined that PFAS will be included in our next nationwide monitoring cycle for the uncontaminated monitoring rule, monitoring in 2023 and 2025. With respect to cleanup, EPA has initiated the process for listing PFOA and PFOS, again, the same 2 compounds as hazardous substances under CERCLA. That's still pending. That would actually give us a regulatory hook to require people to clean these compounds up. Okay. We don't currently have a PFAS-specific regulatory requirement. Recommendations for current recommendations for groundwater contamination. Again, these are recommendations, they're not enforceable. There's a groundwater screening level of 40 parts per trillion and a preliminary remediation goal for contaminated groundwater of 70 parts per trillion. That's the same as the health advisory that I mentioned for drinking water. We're also moving forward with significant new use rules called SNRs to help better understand the use of PFAS and to limit new uses. So we have been reducing the use and reducing the volume. Industry has also voluntarily been reducing use and volume of these compounds as well. We are also requiring PFAS chemical reporting within the toxics release inventory to better understand how these chemicals are being used, how much is being used, and which companies are using them. Enforcement. Well, as I mentioned, we don't have any enforceable regulatory concentrations at this point for PFAS. We have only health advisories and recommended screening levels for cleanup sites and water. So as a result, our enforcement strategy really relies first on state, tribal, and local authorities and uses federal authorities as appropriate where we may need to step in. But at this point, it's the states, tribes, and locals who are addressing this issue. And I think responsible parties, a number of responsible parties are also looking at how they can voluntarily address PFAS. They see the writing on the wall. We do have some backup potential federal enforcement regulations and response authorities through the Safe Drinking Water Act and through RCRA and TSCA should we need to bring those in, but those would only be a backup to local regulations. We released systematic review protocols under IRIS, the Integrated Risk Information System, for 5 PFAS for public review in 2019. And we've got 5 separate IRIS assessments that are underway. You can see the chemicals there: PFDA, PFNA, PFHXA, PFHXS, and PFBA. This is in addition to the PFOS and PFOA. We're conducting a lot of research to try and better understand how to deal with this compound. In particular, we're very concerned about PFAS in waste streams, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, and disposal of activated carbon and other technologies that may be, such as reverse osmosis, that may be used for treatment at various drinking water facilities. So we've invested $6 million to research potential environmental impacts of PFAS in waste streams, again, looking for destruction disposal technologies, $4.8 million in funding for new research on managing PFAS in agriculture. And that's because we are seeing impacts of PFAS contaminated water, groundwater that's been used to provide drinking water for crops and livestock having some impacts. So we're trying to better understand that exposure pathway as well. We have air research as well. You can read, we're developing methods, analytical methods for PFAS in air, both emissions from treatment systems as well as ambient air, dispersion modeling to better understand air transport and evaluating the effectiveness of thermal treatments. This is probably the most important one. We're trying to understand whether or not we can use incineration to fully destroy PFAS materials as a destruction methodology. The Department of Defense, EPA, and Department of Energy have been working together through the CERDP and ESTCP programs to do a whole bunch of research. I'm not going to go over what's going on there because it's just a ton of good research. And the reason that DoD is involved in this is because they have used firefighting foam extensively at their facilities around the world. And they know they own a big part of this problem, and they're moving actively to better understand how to treat these sites and how to dispose of contaminated media. Oops. So now I'm going to switch gears from the PFAS Action Plan and talk to you about give you some updates and information on collaborations with EPA Region 9 tribes and states. First thing, and so I'll talk about tribal PFAS sampling. I'll talk about what we've done with Arizona, California, Guam, Hawaii, and then introduce you to some EPA tools that you can access to get more information on PFAS. So just wanted to give you some information under the Uncontaminated Monitoring Rule number 3, between 2013 and 2015, EPA sampled nationwide for PFAS compounds. And this is the time when this compound really came, the results of this sampling, nationwide sampling, really helped us understand the wide distribution of this contaminant. And I just wanted everyone to realize that as part of that sampling, 31 tribal drinking water systems were sampled around the country, 15 large systems, 16 small systems, and within EPA Region 9, 11 tribal systems were sampled. You can see on the map where they're located roughly, 25 groundwater sources, 1 surface water source. PFAS was detected in 1 tribal system. That well has been taken out of service. That well was returned non-detect. When it was resampled 6 months and 1 year later, it remains out of service. The source, potential source is not determined. And we actually think, because it was sampled in 2015, that it could be possibly lab and sampling error. People were still learning how to do some of the analyses. I took that data from the UCMR3 tribal data set, and you can look at that yourself, all publicly available. Looking to sampling in the future, future Region 9 tribal PFAS drinking water sampling is going to be offered to all EPA regulated public water systems. That's systems with greater than 15 service connections or serving greater than 25 people, 60 days per year or more. This is a voluntary and non-regulatory sampling. It will be no cost to tribes. The sampling is planned for spring and summer 2021. There's going to be a presentation tomorrow with more information, the Tribal Drinking Water Team update. A presentation, not tomorrow, excuse me, October 14th. I misspoke. October 14th from 9 to 10 a.m. And they'll give more information on this upcoming sampling opportunity. Or you can contact Emmanuel Rapicaboli or Ian Chen. So that's good news coming in the future to get some free analysis of your drinking water well. All right, so here's some of the information that we've got on PFAS from state programs. This is important because the more we know about state wells and potential sources, we can use that information when tribes are in the vicinity of these wells or these potential sources. So Arizona sampled public water supply systems near facilities with possible current or historic PFAS use. In general, these were industrial use facilities, firefighting, manufacturing, airports, and research indicated that PFAS was not really used on a large scale in Arizona, and there's no known production of these chemicals in Arizona, just end use. They sampled 109 drinking water wells, 68 public water supply systems in 12 counties. The total number of public water supply systems is 1,500, so you can see this is quite a small subset, but it was done based on proximity to potential sources. The results were really pretty good. 89 samples were non-detect, 14 were below the EPA health advisory, and 6 were above the EPA health advisory. So this indicates that PFAS are not widespread, at least near these potential sources, and PFAS contamination tends to be localized near potential sources. So ADEQ is working to limit exposure and prevent exposure at those wells. California has been doing extensive sampling adjacent to airports, landfills, plating facilities, and they will soon be sampling wastewater treatment plants, influent, effluent, and biosolids. So we're working with them, doing some data analysis and data visualization, trying to answer the question, can we visually discern any PFAS chemical occurrence trends within their data? And yes, we did see some trends. In fact, one of the big trends we saw is that there were roughly 8 compounds that appeared in all the samples across California. And even though they sampled for a much longer list, 8 were the main compounds of concern. So that's nice, considering there's roughly 6,000 of these chemicals out there, that we're not dealing with such a huge number. And so we work to do that analysis, and it's preliminary, and we're starting to pull some of the trends out and better understand what the distribution of PFAS chemicals look like adjacent to specific types of sources, essentially trying to fingerprint what PFAS distributions may look like adjacent to certain sources, and what the PFAS plumes may look like as they migrate through the subsurface, as the PFAS contamination may move at different rates within the subsurface. We also worked with Guam to do a preliminary PFAS vulnerability assessment for the wells on Guam. In fact, PFAS was detected at concentrations up to 550 parts per trillion in one of the wells on Guam. 109 wells were sampled during UCMR3, and that was some of the highest concentrations that we saw in UCMR3. And being an island nation without many alternatives for their drinking water or drinking water replacement, this is a big issue to Guam. So we started looking at how we could better understand the vulnerability. We did what would be termed a wellhead protection area study, where we basically drew circles around all the wells. You can see these little blue-gray circles around all the wells on Guam. They look like little targets. And we looked at the potential sources within each of those circles and added them all up to get a vulnerability ranking for each of the wells. We looked at the sources. You can see the bar graph here. There were a lot of potential sources. The biggest one was Department of Defense. There was a lot of Department of Defense facilities and buildings around the island. But we don't know if that's an office building or a warehouse that's containing, canisters of PFAS. We have no idea. Furniture manufacturing, machinery manufacturing, miscellaneous manufacturing. And the reason I'm mentioning this with the potential sources is we have a lot of uncertainty about potential sources. We don't really know where the sources are because it's just hard to tell from land use data or from even the type of activity that's going on at the facility. So, but we did use what we could with PFAS-related NAICS codes. We did the analysis, and the model predicted that we had 7% high vulnerability wells. You can see the map to the right with the red, orange, and yellow vulnerabilities, high, medium, and low plotted. The good news is more than half the wells were low priority, and about a third of them were medium, and a very small amount, 7%, were ranked as high priority or high vulnerability. Now, this is not a standalone evaluation. We need to be careful when we're using this, and we need sampling to verify the model and use other Guam-specific information to help us support PFAS sampling decisions. But this is certainly a start for understanding where we might go out and do some additional sampling on the island. Hawaii, for those of you who are looking into action levels or cleanup levels, Hawaii has just issued their interim environmental action levels. Dr. Roger Brewer has been working on this for 18 PFAS compounds. He's currently accepting comments and will issue the final EALs in fall 2020. Aquatic toxicity is under development. That'll be ocean aquatic toxicity for the island of Hawaii. And you can see the, the links here if you want more information or if you're trying to develop action levels for PFAS issues. One last thing here, EPA has released the PFAS Analytical Tools. It displays multiple data sources on an interactive map, includes PFAS manufacture, release, occurrence in the environment, and facilities potentially handling PFAS. You can look at integrated maps, drinking water, production, environmental media, response locations, federal sites, industry sectors. You can download the data. Now, this tool doesn't include all available PFAS data, but it includes what EPA has access to. And I've included instructions on how to gain access to this tool as the last two slides in my presentation. And you need to, if you're going to request access to this tool, it sits in a special place on the EPA servers. It sits just inside the firewall, but not all the way inside the firewall. So you have to get actually an account to be able to use this. And as tribal partners, you're welcome to have an account. You just need to follow the instructions and make sure that you're sending your request from a tribal email address would be best. And if you need a sponsor, you can use me or Andrew Gillespie. You'll see that on the informational slides. So these are the two slides that tell you how to access the PFAS analytic tools if you want. That is the end of my presentation. Here's the summary of all the links that I gave during the presentation, and I appreciate your attention.
Great, thank you, Matt. This is John Flores. We'll pause for any questions for Matt before we continue with the next portion of the presentation. We have one, Matt, in the chat box, and it says, do we know what the health effects are on organisms broadly, initial toxicologies, mammalian or aquatics?
We do have some initial toxicity information. I don't think I know all of those right off the top of my head. That's a good question. That would be more a question for our regional toxicologist, Patrick Wilson. But we've certainly seen liver impacts. We've seen elevated cholesterol. We've seen impacts on. We've seen birth impacts. They're all non-carcinogenic impacts. I'll be clear about that. All of these are non-carcinogenic impacts. And you can read more on the impacts on the health impacts on our EPA.gov PFAS site. And it details those specific toxicological expressions that we see from exposure to PFAS.
Great. We have another question. It says, which 8 compounds were identified as a trend in the California testing?
That's another good question. I'm sorry, I don't have a slide on that, and I can't rattle them off the top of my head, but they were PFAS, PFOA were two of the bigger ones. PFNA, PFHXS was very prominent. I don't have it listed on this slide. I apologize. PFNA. I don't want to misspeak. Those are some of the main ones. And you can go to this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there is the waterboards.ca.gov PFAS site will give you more information on the compounds that were detected, or you can contact me offline and I'll be happy to give you that info.
So she says, okay, great, thank you. Can you talk a little more about those trends, please?
As I mentioned, we're looking at the trends and still trying to better understand them. But what we're looking at and what we've started pulling out of these trends is evaluating the mobility of the various PFAS compounds. This is one of the big things that we've started to understand, is that not all of these chemicals move through the environment at the same speed, and that we may see different, for a given release, say it releases 8 chemicals, PFAS chemicals, we may see a couple of those that move more slowly and tend to hang around the source, and we may see other chemicals that move more quickly and are found further down gradient in the groundwater plume. And the implications that this has for our response to these kinds of contaminant plumes is that we may have different chemicals that are driving the risk in different parts of the plume. For example, if PFOA tends to hang around the source more, PFOA, that may tend to drive the risk around the source area, whereas PFOS or PFH excess, which tend to move more quickly and are a little bit more toxic, may be driving the risk in the plume down gradient. That's just one of the things we're starting to look at.
All right, and then one more question, and then we're gonna get on with the next presentation. And then if more people have questions we can ask on the back end. So last one is, were there more surface water or groundwater testing? The person says they apologize, they came in a little late, so they don't know if they missed that in the beginning.
At this point, it's all been groundwater. Well, excuse me, I don't want to misspeak. Under UCMR3, we tested both groundwater and surface water sources. The efforts in Arizona and California and Guam have all been groundwater testing. So yes, we've tested both groundwater and surface water sources. However, the focus lately has been really on the groundwater drinking water wells and understanding potential impacts to those resources.
Great, thank you. She says, okay, great, that's what I had heard as well. Great, so yeah, let's move on to the second portion of the presentation. You want to cue up that slide and we'll get rolling on that?
Yeah, let me figure out how to swap here.
Yes, give him a moment while he swaps over to the news presentation. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to our second presenter of the hour. And, if you have any questions, please, type them in the chat box and we'll get on to those questions as soon as this presentation is complete. I'll turn this over to you.
Are you seeing Suzanne's presentation now?
Yeah, it's up. Thank you, Matt. And for those who are coming in late, the second half is more specifically concerned with the tribal risks and tribal exposures. And I'm speaking as the Region 9 representative for the National Tribal Toxics Council. And to answer your question, I'm sorry, I eliminated a lot of the details about the actual health outcomes from the PFAS. From this presentation to save time, but there is longer slideshows on the National Tribal Toxics Council's website, and that link is in this presentation. So we'll just touch base on it as we go ahead. So welcome. I'm glad everybody could make it. And one other apology here. Those of you who don't believe in Murphy's Law, I do. I had a beautiful setting outside for this, and then my neighbors started cutting down and grinding up their trees at 2 o'clock. So I hastily moved inside. I can see the lighting isn't the best in here, but it's a pretty quiet room. So hopefully you can still follow along, and I apologize for any difficulties in my at-home setup. So I think we're ready to go on to the next slide. Thank you, Matt. So real quick, NTTC, National Tribal Toxics Council, and we're putting that out here from the front as kind of a pitch to let people understand and know that the EPA does have a tribal partnership group, and that's this National Tribal Toxics Council, and we work with the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics in their headquarters in Washington, D.C. We have representatives from all 10 regions so that we can get a comprehensive review and aspects and capture concerns from across the nation. And so I hope you guys can take a look at our website, contact me, follow along, because I think it's extremely important that we work with OPPT as tribes to try and get them aware of tribal concerns, unique tribal exposures, and how we feel that EPA should be incorporating them into their risk assessments that sets all those different levels that Matt has talked about. Currently, in almost all of them, the tribal exposures and the tribal representation as a susceptible subpopulation isn't being adequately captured to be protective of tribal lifeways. And so this will come out, I hope, in this presentation. Next. This is, again, I caught ahead of myself. When they do risk assessments, just as an example, you know, they don't use the local clams that are collected, single source procurement and harvesting of say, the fish. So we're here doing it. You know, they're not looking at bark peeling and how come different exposures of chemicals, air deposition might be on the barks. The fact that, you know, harvesting is done multi-generationally. So our children go out with the adults and they're an extremely susceptible population. So just a quick overview of some of these captures of tribal lifeways. So Matt had mentioned that TSCA, when it comes to the chemicals that are actually in manufacturing or consumer products in the United States, it's controlled by TSCA, Toxic Substances Control Act. And although you'd think, okay, manufacturing, maybe that's not in my area. Today, with the chemicals, more and more sophisticated. They have cross-media transport. We all know in the Alaska and Arctic areas, because of the global air deposition, they're hotspots for many of these chemicals. If your reservation is downstream from manufacturing, even though it might be hundreds of miles away, you could possibly still be having impacts from this. And so that's the main focus that the Tribal Toxics Council is trying to get representation and protections into the work that the EPA is doing. And so 82,000 chemicals, 95% of all the chemicals used within the states are regulated under TSCA, including the PFAS and PFAS. So what are the concerns? This kind of just captures a lot of what Matt said, but 95% of the human population does have PFAS toxin burden in their bodies. And that's just because of this widespread application. They are bioaccumulative, so that they're stored. Generally, most of these chemicals that are major chemicals of concern are stored in the fats. And so they go up the food chain. So as far as you were asking, you know, what are some of these impacts? Our Michigan from around the Great Lakes tribes sent us a slide saying, you know, the state there has put out a health warning not to eat the deer meat. You know, certain areas have do not eat the fish. And so if this is what your traditions and your culture rely on, then you're stuck. You know, we as the Tribal Toxics Council are saying that we would like the levels of environmental releases to be protective so that we don't have to have these kinds of do not eat and fish advisories out there. And that's one of the things we're pushing forward, and why we ask the other tribes everywhere to consider joining in on these EPA consultation calls, even if it comes to a chemical that you may not understand the big scope of, you can still understand some of these impacts. Just quickly, you know, they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere that we say. Well, there is a comment that, you know, well, they've been mainly used in the 40s through the 70s and they've been phased out. However, when it comes to tribal populations, even though the new, say, carpeting or the new backing of drapes that used to be sprayed with the flame retardants aren't there, in the tribal homes, so many things are secondhand, so many things are passed onward that it's not out of our environment. We're not gone from tribal exposures as they might be in the mainstem population. So here's how they end up with some sort of tribal emphasis. Matt had mentioned that in the landfills, the leachate, as well as the surface water runoff on some of these compounds are highly transporting these chemicals. So the other thing is that the EPA on the federal level don't regulate all the landfills, and they have delegated to the states that ability. And if the states have given a waiver that landfills do not have to be lined, which is almost all of our Region 10 Alaska native village areas, then there is no protections. And that's one thing we're asking for EPA in their assessments to include, that even though they say landfills check mark because, you know, they know that they're protected, that's only the major metropolitan and commercial areas of the states. And so wherever there's an exemption, I suggest you check on your local states and find out if the landfills being used around you, certainly upstream of any of your water sources, find out again if they're required to be lined landfills, or if they're been exempted. If they're exempted, they could be passing through this. 50% of the ones that were tested across the US, whether they were lined or not, still had leachate and had PFAS in them. So the ones that attach to sediments, if you're downstream and you're gathering basketry materials, you could be having impacts from them. If you're gathering fish who perhaps spend part of their time or spawn in the small streams and inlets that feed off of landfills, they could be impacted. And if you eat them, then your tribal members are impacted. It's these old dumps that are the major concern for tribal communities everywhere. We see again the SNRs, significant new uses of chemicals, and one of them are same classes of chemicals like Teflon, which has been discontinued because of the PFAS in them. And they've using similar things, same classes of families. So the next generation, Generation X, and so that's moved forward, but we haven't got enough scientific data to really analyze the impacts. And so that's why EPA is moving toward these reviews of emerging concerns. So anytime the basic premise of the National Tribal Toxics Council is if there are environmental contaminants, tribal members or anybody, other ethnics and subsistence peoples who are in the environment more will have greater exposures to these chemicals, and it's linked. And for tribal peoples, we have treaties, we have federal trust responsibilities that are supposed to be protecting our resources that are unique to the traditions in our treaties and our rights. And so you can't separate these from the tribal peoples, and we ask that additional review of assessments be undertaken. These are, again, I'm just going to kind of skip over them. We've talked about them. HBCD is an older fire retardant. It is also being under review for significant new uses. Here's our Alaska landfills, and it has the open exposures to the media, the air, the water moving through these and around these. Don't just stay in the landfill. Obviously, they move and can provide major problems. I just threw that in to get the pictures. I'm a picture person, folks, so. So the good news is part of the across the board, it was bipartisan concerns, is there was a new TSCA. It was the Lautenberg Amendment that was passed through Congress on one of those do nothing Congress years. And it was so important that it did pass in 2016. And so the legislature itself now has in there that risk evaluations must include considerations of exposed or susceptible subpopulations. And this was a huge and major breakthrough, and EPA is scrambling to figure out how to best do this and how to incorporate them. This is where we're saying to the administrator of EPA, it's like almost all of these, unless they're occupational restricted ones, would have tribal members as an exposed subpopulation. This is showing it again. The young woman on the bottom of the screen, I just wanted to bring up, that was a lamprey eel she's holding. And we know they're not considered in the standard risk assessments, and they're extremely fatty, almost 20% lipids. And the numbers of fish and fish consumption. There is a need to have these incorporated into risk assessments. Thanks, Matt. So these aren't specific to PFAS, but through the census and the standard data gathering, most people know that there's a disproportionate occurrence of certain health impacts in Indian country. And many of these on studies that are linked to environmental contaminants are directly showing up in tribal census data. And infant mortality at 55%, obesity, which people are saying, oh, you know, that's just eating commodities, but there are many environmental contaminants that are now considered obesogens that are actually changing the metabolism of the bodies through chemical suppression, and so there's a lot more going on. And so this goes on and on. This is just a few of them. Stomach cancers, skin cancers. We all know the diabetes. If you pull it out though, the national Native American rate is twice, but your local amount might be higher. And again, we cannot make a direct causation to these because of the epidemiology studies, but we still put forth the basis that these are proven outcomes to environmental contaminants. And if there is more contact and exposure in the environment, then it only is a logical extension that some or most of these increases in health would be also associated with those environmental contaminants. So this was the running down again, specific tribal concerns you might have. And if you were to make a comment letter, I suggest these are some you might be able to look into and include. Again, these unlined landfills. Also, not just from the actual landfills, but on the Yurok reservation, for example, we have transfer stations. And so we have it as a staging area before it gets collected and taken to the more county or municipal landfills. During that time, is it exposed to the environment, the rains? Are there creeks, water bodies that are seeping through there? If so, that would become a concern. Our area does a lot of the burn barrels. There are studies that, you know, the air deposition is within 15 feet around that burn barrel. Well, that's somebody's backyard where the kids are playing with their little Hot Wheels in the dust. So it's something to be considered. In Alaska, it was brought up, they have a lot of the pink board insulation because of their, you know, weather concerns. That is very high in PFAS, and yet it is often just thrown not as a hazardous material in these landfills. And so it's something to think about, ways that you could regulate it on your reservation. Perhaps you could have a covered area if you do a lot of construction where you could store these brown boards, the solid insulation ones. The other thing on this list I want to bring up just briefly is the drinking water. So Matt talked about all of the good work that EPA is doing on the drinking water, and I want to bring up that this is on the public drinking water systems. In our area, I'm going to throw it out there, at least a third of our population have private systems, and it comes from surface water. And so it's also subject that their water could possibly be having contamination that's not regulated through EPA. And it's something on the tribal level, depending on, of course, your situation, you might really want to be considered. And the last thing, some of these fire retardants, we call them that, but they're also were used because they don't wash away as readily as the old oils on the dirt roads. And so there are some of the compounds that are currently sprayed to keep the dust down that include these PFAS. And so it's something you might consider looking into again at your local area. So drinking water we talked about, these were the public ones. They're also the private homes. Our small systems will often have 3 members, homes, multi-generational people, but they'll get together and invest in their storage tanks or something in their private ones. But as far as protections for tribal populations, do you use untreated water for ceremonies? Are there sweats involved? And so you just have to think about how your people are out there in the environment. Again, what percentage of your local people are subsistence out there collecting, you know, the deer meat, acorns are big in our areas, the dust and dirt from them, are there concerns for this? And then as far as the risk assessments, again, saying how is EPA capturing these tribal exposures? If I'm out there harvesting and then also preparing traditional foods, then I am going to have a higher exposure, a higher dose in my body of those chemicals. And so that's where we're asking for consultations and suggesting, hey, let's all try and get together and put forth the importance of that to tribes, to EPA. This little pyramid looking thing is actually drying smelt. Again, that's not been captured in any risk assessment that we know of. And so it is a unique tribal exposure, susceptible subpopulation. Reinforcing that, again, it's like many of the risk assessments are linked to zip codes and where your home is. But as you know, most tribal peoples gather their resources throughout. They'll spend time in the mountain doing the elk and the deer hunting or the moose hunting, you know, and then they move and collect acorns. And so it goes down throughout the whole environment, again, just bringing up the many crossing and unique exposures that a tribal lifeway could possibly have. So I said we've had some good things going on. EPA is trying to figure out how to incorporate these different aspects. We're petitioning heavily to try and get them to consider tribal peoples everywhere as an exposed subpopulation, mostly up from the work on the Columbia River tribes in Region 10. EPA has just recently updated their fish ingestion rate. If you are a fishing tribe, what was used as a standard once a week fish meal the size of the palm of your hand was not being protective of the amount of exposures that calculated in fish that I would eat. And so they have increased it, at least for acute seasonal consumption, to be more reasonable and more in line with what we have in tribal communities. So yay. However, the EPA said that for the cumulative, the long-term ones, they felt that the tribal consumption was protected under a standard bell shape, and that it didn't need to include these higher fish consumption rates. While working on the Pacific Coast, some of the tribes in Oregon, they have a saying that, you know, why did the creator create halibut? And that's a year-round fish. And that's so when you're tired of dried fish, you'll have fresh fish. And that's how much fish is in tribal diets year-round. And so we're still pushing the EPA to do better at trying to capture a realistic look. For the Yurok there in the north of California, we have the spring Chinook salmon followed by the fall and the steelhead. Then we have the eels run, then the sturgeon are coming in. And so it's a lot of fish, and that's traditional and that's not unusual. And so that would be a chronic exposure. And so we're asking for calculations to be inclusive of that. And if you are any of these kinds of fishing tribes, I suggest you might consider being sure in consultation calls, you may want to reference some work about a chronic exposure and not just an acute seasonal exposure. Thanks. So what are some of the things as tribal nations and communities we could do? Once again, we can make comments. We can also have tribal resolutions that are sent to EPA regardless of whether they're in a consultation period, saying that you want tribal lifeways and tribal populations represented more in risk assessments. If you have fast food packaging on your reservation, perhaps you could have an ordinance and ban the use of PFAS packaging. One of the things with food, the transfer of PFAS is often associated with heat. And so the biggest one on a national sampling was the pizza boxes. We don't know that when we just look at it and we order our pizzas. But 5 or 6 years ago, there were studies, and the pizza boxes that were oily and stained got comments, and they were losing some of their consumer purchases. And so in general, the pizza industry is spraying pizza boxes with a thin layer of PFAS to hold back that oil. The oil is what has the PFAS in it. And when you put a hot pizza in that box, it was the #1 transfer through the consumption pathway for PFAS. So you could possibly do that. Keep up to date on your state actions, because many of the federal ones get delegated down to the state. Here is the link to the Tribal Toxic Council website. There's some other examples on there. And just stay vigilant. So I did a quick search myself. This, I think, is almost the last one, but for those of us in California, OEHA for the state has, its own separate risk assessments. And so they are currently doing one right now on these PFAS ones. The final date is going to be December 20th, but I think that the consultations are the end of October through November 10th. There it says November 14th. So take a look at that and see what's going on in your states. And this is a big one for California because a lot of the nation will look to California. I suggest you try and get on and make a comment letter saying, please include the unique tribal exposures in the risk assessments on your chemical analyses. So this is the EPA, the big general one, but this is something you might want to just bookmark and every so often go there. Often for us, I know the consultation letters come through the main front door, and the receptionist sorts these situations and sends them to the different departments. And it's very easy to get consultation letters lost and not sent over to our environmental program. I just suggest you try, and I know it's one more burden, but keep up on what's coming down the line through EPA. And this is the site where they have all of the EPA consultations for tribes.
And that is the last slide.
Thank you.
And I'm just, I'm putting up here, someone asked about health effects, so I'm just putting up the EPA website with the health effects info.
Great.
John, do we still have opportunity for some questions for Suzanne?
Yeah, we finished just about on time, but this is the last session of the day, so there's no one behind us. So if anyone has any questions for Suzanne, you can go ahead and unmute yourself or go ahead and type it into the chat box.
I want to thank everybody for coming to our session. I think it is important with all of the busy work that we have to try and stay up to date on these. And I apologize for trying to rush through this, but I thought getting it out and into your sites is probably the best way to engage.
No, thank you, Suzanne. We had very good attendance on this one. I think we were at about 45, 46 people that attended this session, so that's great. We had some good questions, and I found it very informative. So if no one has any questions at this time, I would like to thank our two presenters for giving a wonderful presentation today. And thank you for everyone's time for coming today, and we'll see everyone next week when we resume the conference. Take care and stay healthy. Bye.
Thanks, John. Thanks everybody for coming. Take care.